I recently faced my own worst nightmare. The HOA president just chained my only gate and tried to interfere with my cattle. And her excuse? She said I was clashing with property values. The only thing clashing that day was her face when she learned the lane she just fenced was mine. Let me start from the beginning. The first thing you notice is the sound, or the lack of it. When 100 head of cattle are thirsty, there's a low, restless music they machia, a shuffling of hooves on dry ground, a mournful sound that gets under your skin. That sound had been the background of my life for a week. The Texas sun in late July doesn't play games. It beats down on the land until the grass turns the color of straw and the earth cracks like old pottery. My creek, the one that cuts across the back corner of my property, was getting low, but it was still the only reliable water for miles. The problem was, the only way to get the herd there was through a single gate on a dusty access lane that skirted the edge of a new housing development, an HOA community. They called it Whispering Creek Estates, which was a fancy name for a bunch of big houses packed too close together on land that used to be open range. My grandpa, who left me this ranch, always said, "Fences make good neighbors, but a shared gate makes better ones." He had a handshake deal with the old rancher who owned all that land before it got sold and chopped up. That handshake had worked just fine for 50 years. Until Eleanor Vance. I'm a black rancher working my grandpa's land. Eleanor didn't ring my whole ranch in steel. She boxed my only gate. Same trap, less metal. I saw the lock from 50 yards away. It was a big, ugly thing, brassy and new against the weathered gray wood of the gate post. A thick silver chain, the kind you'd use to tow a truck, was wrapped around the gate and post again and again, overkill by a mile. They'd even set 2 fresh panel fence sections at the mouth, a tidy little corral around my gate. It was a statement. I pulled my dusty Ford to a stop, the engine ticking in the heat. I just sat there for a minute, looking at it. My grandpa's gate, the one my hands had helped him fix a dozen times. Now it was chained up like a crime scene. I got out, my boots crunching on the gravel, my truck keys hung from my belt, hot metal against my hip. The air was so hot it felt like you were breathing through a wool blanket. The cattle were behind me, bunched up, their dark eyes watching me, waiting. They knew this path. They could smell the water. I put my hand on the chain. It was heavy and cold, a strange feeling in the oppressive heat. This wasn't just a lock. This was a message. I knew who sent it. I called the number for the HOA, the one on the little sign tacked to a post a few feet away. It was a professionally printed sign with a weeping willow logo. That was the small info sign. 2 days later, they planted a big red warning sign. Everything about this place felt manufactured. Eleanor Vance answered on the second ring. Her voice was clipped and smooth, like ice cubes clinking in a glass. Whispering Creek Homeowners Association, Eleanor Vance speaking. I kept my own voice low and steady. "Ma'am, this is Marcus Thorne from the Thorne Ranch next door. Someone's locked the access gate to my pasture." There was a pause. I could almost hear her smiling. "Yes, Mr. Thorne. The board has decided to secure all HOA access points. That lane is association property. Your use of it was, frankly, illegal and unauthorized access." I took a breath, letting the hot air fill my lungs. "Ma'am, my family has used this gate to water our cattle for longer than this HOA has existed. My grandfather had an agreement." She made a little sound, something between a laugh and a scoff. "Well, I'm afraid your grandfather's agreements don't supersede our community bylaws. We have standards to maintain. We can't have livestock creating a nuisance. This is for the protection of our residents and their property values. It's a liability issue." I knew right then that talking to her was like talking to a brick wall. A well-dressed, polite brick wall. So, I did what you're supposed to do. I called the sheriff's department. 2 deputies showed up about 20 minutes later, kicking up a cloud of dust that settled on everything. They were young, looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. Eleanor Vance must have been watching from her window because her pristine white SUV pulled up right behind them. She stepped out wearing a navy blue suit and a bright pink blouse. Not a drop of sweat on her. She looked like she was heading to a bank meeting, not a dusty standoff by a cattle gate. She gave the deputies a bright, tight smile. "Deputies, thank you for coming. I'm Eleanor Vance, the president of the HOA. Your ranch is illegal under our rules, deputy. He can't use this gate." She said, "ranch," but we all knew she meant my gate. She spoke to them, but her eyes kept flicking over to me, sizing me up. The deputies nodded at her, then looked at me. Their faces were blank, professional. One lip curled, the other wouldn't meet my eyes. I explained the situation calmly. I told them about my grandpa, about the 50 years of use. I pointed to my thirsty cattle. Eleanor stepped in, her tone reasonable, friendly. Deputies, I understand his frustration, but the simple fact is this is private property, our private property. We have a responsibility to our homeowners. She used words like liability and governing documents. She made it sound like I was the one causing the trouble, like I was the intruder. The deputies listened, their posture deferential to her. They looked at her, said, "Ma'am," used my first name, then let their eyes slide past me when I spoke. I saw the slight shift in their stance. They were on her side before I'd even finished my first sentence. They saw her suit and her expensive car, and me in my dusty jeans and sweat-stained shirt. And they made a choice. One of the deputies finally turned to me, his hand resting near his sidearm. "Sir, I hear what you're saying, but from where we stand, this looks like a civil matter. It's a property dispute. You'll have to work it out with the HOA or take it to court. We can't force her to remove the lock." He said it like he was reading from a script. "Work it out," he said. I looked at Eleanor's smug, triumphant face. I looked at the deputies who wouldn't quite meet my eye. And I looked at the heavy, unyielding chain on my gate. The law had come, and the law had left, and my cattle were still thirsty. The older deputy took a slow look at my herd and the sunburned fence, then at my face. "Just don't escalate, Marcus," he said. I hadn't moved an inch. I could taste dust and pride in my mouth. Eleanor drifted closer, phone up, filming, keeping me in the frame like a trophy. "We're a family community," she said lightly to no one and everyone. "We can't have ranch traffic coming through in waves." The pause before ranch hung in the heat. A cow bawled hard. The sound shoved through us like a warning. At the back of the bunch, two steers leaned on the new panel fence the HOA had set to box the gate. The panel flexed and popped but held. One deputy twitched toward his holster. "Ma'am, please step back from the animals," he said. To Eleanor, not to me. "I called you to help," I told him. "Quiet. You told me it's civil. I accept that." My eyes slid to the lock. "But my water is 30 yards away, and this lock is new metal on an old promise." He shifted his jaw, eyes sliding off mine. "Then take it to court," he said again, like a line he'd practiced. Eleanor offered a final bright nod. Victory smile. And the convoy rolled out. The only sound left was the chain knocking the post, and 100 heads turning toward the creek they couldn't reach. That land is more than just dirt and grass to me. It's a history book. My history book. Every fence post, every bend in the creek, every shady spot under a live oak tree holds a story. My grandpa, William Thorne, bought the first 100 acres back in the 50s with money he'd saved up working on oil rigs out in the Permian Basin. He was a big man with hands like leatherwork gloves, and he could calm a spooked horse with just a word. He added parcels over the years, bit by bit, until he had a spread he was proud of. He taught me how to mend a fence, how to read the sky for rain, and how to tell when a calf was about to be born just by the way the mother cow stood. He taught me that the land doesn't belong to you. You belong to it. You're just its caretaker for a little while. When he passed, he left it all to me. It wasn't just a gift of property. It was a gift of trust. He was trusting me to be its caretaker. Now, the access lane was part of that trust. Back then, the whole area was just a few big ranches. The fellow who owned the land where the HOA now sits was a man named Gunther Bauer. Gunther and my grandpa were friends. Not the kind of friends who went to dinner, but the kind who'd pull each other's trucks out of the mud, no questions asked. The creek was the lifeblood for both their herds, and that little lane was the easiest way for both of them to get their cattle down to the water in the dry season. So, they made a deal. Gunther let Grandpa use the lane, and Grandpa let Gunther's herd graze on a patch of his north pasture when Gunther's was picked clean. No lawyers, no papers. Just two men, a bottle of whiskey, and a handshake under the big Texas sky. That was how things were done. Your word was your bond. For decades, it worked. Gunther sold the land to a developer in the late 90s. And even they understood. The sales agent told Grandpa the access would be preserved. Not in writing, not in the deed, just a promise. And it was. Until now. These new folks, the ones in Whispering Creek, they didn't understand that history. They were mostly people from big cities: Dallas, Houston, Austin. They wanted the view of the country without the reality of it. They wanted manicured lawns and quiet streets. They didn't like the smell of manure or the sound of a tractor at dawn. To them, my ranch wasn't a living, breathing operation that had been here for generations. It was just a messy, unpredictable neighbor. And Eleanor Vance was their queen. She drove the conversation at their meetings, talking about community standards and protecting our investment. She saw my cattle not as a legacy, but as a threat to her perfect, sterile world. That subtle bias was always there, just under the surface. When she'd say things like, "We need to maintain the character of our kind of community," it was clear what she meant. My kind of community, a working ranch run by a black man, was not her kind of community. I want to see Calvin Hayes. Calvin's a retired trucker who lives in a small house on the other side of my property. He's been in this county his whole life. He's 75 with a memory like a steel trap. I found him on his porch, sipping iced tea and listening to a ball game on the radio. I told him what happened. He just nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "Knew this was coming," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Saw it the day they put up that fancy brick entrance. People who build walls like that aren't interested in being neighbors." He confirmed everything my grandpa had told me. He remembered Gunther Bauer. He remembered the handshake deal. "Everyone knew, Marcus," he said. "Everyone knew that was your family's water access. It was just the way it was. Never needed a piece of paper to prove the sun comes up in the east." He was right. We never thought we'd need it. The world had changed around the ranch. The old rules of honor and a man's word had been replaced by a 3-ring binder full of bylaws and covenants. Calvin leaned forward, his old joints creaking. "That woman, Vance, she's the type that thinks because she can write a rule, it makes her right. She doesn't care about history. She cares about control." He looked me square in the eye. "You can't reason with a person like that. You got to find a different way to talk to them a language they understand." He meant the law, the fine print. The problem was, I was a rancher, not a lawyer. I knew cattle and I knew the land, but I didn't know a thing about bylaws and property disputes. History was on my side. Decency was on my side. But Eleanor Vance had a binder full of rules and a brand new lock. As I drove home, the dust from the road settling on my dashboard, I felt a deep, quiet anger. This wasn't just about water. It was about respect. It was about my grandpa's legacy, and I realized that if I wanted to defend it, I was going to have to learn a new language fast. The next morning, the squeeze began. Tacked to the gate, right next to the new lock, was a laminated piece of paper. It was an official notice from the Whispering Creek HOA. In bold black letters, it cited a bylaw about unauthorized use of common property and levied a fine of $200. Below that, in smaller print, it said the fine would double for every 24 hours the violation continued. I wasn't even using the lane, but apparently, my desire to use it was violation enough. I tore it off the post, the plastic crinkling in my hand. It felt like I was being punished for a crime I hadn't even committed. $200. That was feed money, vet money. It wasn't going to break me, but it was a clear shot across the bow. It was Eleanor Vance telling me she had the power and she wasn't afraid to use it. 2 days later, a work crew came out. They planted a huge, obnoxious sign right in front of the gate. 2 men in matching polos measured the posts like they were setting a memorial. One read the wording to the other 3 times, savoring the big letters. "Private property. Contact the Homeowners Association. Violators will be prosecuted." He asked me if the arrow looked centered. "You're on my fence line," I said. He nodded, satisfied, as if I'd complimented his spacing. A neighbor couple in gym clothes slowed their jog, phones up for pictures. "Wow, they finally did something," the man murmured. The woman wrinkled her nose at the cattle and at me the same way. A delivery van stopped. The driver leaned out and said, "Y'all really prosecuting violators? Or is that just font?" The sign guy answered without humor. "Policy." Ricky Sims bounced up in his clattery Tacoma, hopped out with a grin, and posed beside the sign like it was a landmark on Route 66. "Take my picture," he said, handing me his phone. Caption: "Visited the world's biggest overreaction." I didn't smile, but I took the picture. Eleanor's white SUV rolled by, slow and royal. She didn't stop. She didn't need to. The message stood 8 feet tall, red and white, shouting for her. That night, wind rattled the metal sheet, and it sounded like a lid slapping a boiling pot. The pot was me. It was impossible to miss. Red, loud, and aimed at me. It was positioned so that anyone driving down the main road would see it. It was designed to humiliate, to make it look like I was the one in the wrong, the one trying to trespass. People from the neighborhood would slow down their cars, pointing. I could feel their eyes on me as I worked the fence line nearby. It was a slow, grinding pressure meant to wear me down. Meanwhile, the real pressure was building in the pasture. I was hauling water now, using the big tank on the back of my flatbed truck. It was a slow, expensive process. A few hundred gallons at a time, twice a day. It took hours out of my workday, hours I should have been spending on other chores. The fuel costs were piling up, and the cattle were stressed. They weren't getting enough, and they knew their creek was just on the other side of that fence. They would line up at the fence, lowing, smelling the water they couldn't reach. It was a constant, heartbreaking reminder of the fight I was in. The nights were the worst. I'd lie in bed, the fan rattling in the window, and I'd just think. I'd think about the money bleeding out of my operation. I'd think about the smug look on Eleanor Vance's face. I'd think about my grandpa and wonder if I was failing him. The core of it all, that question, how far will a man go to defend his own? It wasn't an abstract idea anymore. It was the question I woke up with and went to bed with every single day. The answer had to be more than just anger. It had to be smart. I knew a head-on fight was what she wanted. She wanted me to lose my temper, to cut the chain, to give her a reason to call the deputies back and have me arrested for destruction of property. She was baiting a trap, and I wasn't going to walk into it. The turning point came on a Thursday night. I was just about to turn in when I heard a heavy engine rumbling down the main road. It was late, almost 11. I went to the window and looked out. A big tow truck, the kind used for heavy equipment, was pulling up to the access lane. It slid across the subdivision shoulder, nose to the lane's mouth, not the county road. It sat there like a plug, inside their side, not on county pavement. The new panel fences turned it into a clean, tight, boxed. It maneuvered into position, completely blocking the entrance from the road. Then a smaller car pulled up behind it. A man got out of the car. He wasn't big or threatening, just a regular guy in a polo shirt. I recognized him from a picture in the HOA newsletter. He was on the board, one of Eleanor's lieutenants. I grabbed my phone, my heart starting to beat a little faster. I slipped out the back door, staying in the shadows of the mesquite trees that lined my property. I crept closer, making sure the phone was recording. The night was dark, but the tow truck's flashing yellow lights cast long, dancing shadows. The board member walked up to the gate with a flashlight and a brand new, even bigger chain. He started wrapping it around the post, pulling it tight, adding it to the one that was already there. He was reinforcing it. The tow truck was there to make sure I couldn't get a feed delivery truck or my water tanker anywhere near the lane. It was a deliberate, calculated escalation. They were trying to choke me out completely. I just stood there in the dark, my phone held steady, the little red light glowing. I didn't say a word. I didn't shout or confront him. My grandpa always said, never interrupt your enemy when he's making a mistake. And this was a mistake. This wasn't about bylaws anymore. This was a targeted, aggressive action. And I had it all on video. I watched until he was done, until he got back in his car and drove away, leaving the tow truck and the double-chained gate like a monument to their spite. I walked back to my house, the recording safe on my phone. I finally had a piece of evidence. It wasn't a solution, but it was something. It was a weapon. And I knew with a calm certainty that settled deep in my gut that I was going to get the chance to use it. I eased closer through the mesquite, thorns catching my shirt. The boardman's flashlight swung wide and white across the brush. I went still. He listened. Somewhere, a calf puffed a short, confused snort. The light crawled over the trunk I hid behind, then slid on. The tow truck driver yelled, bored and loud. You good, Todd? So that was his name. Yeah, Todd hissed, tugging the chain one more time. The steel screamed on steel and set my teeth on edge. I zoomed in, framed his hands, his face, the plate on the truck, the timestamp on my phone. The camera shook a little from my heartbeat, so I braced my wrist against bark, quiet as prayer. Todd finished, stepped back to admire his work like it was art, then snapped his own photo for the board chat. The irony made me almost laugh. A mesquite thorn drove into my palm when I shifted. The sting flashed hot, bright, human. I bit it down. On his way out, Todd's beam slid across the red sign. He patted it like a faithful dog, then climbed into his sedan. The tow truck stayed, idling, blocking the mouth of the lane. When their taillights vanished, the night fell shut. I pulled the thorn, sucked the blood, and whispered, thank you, to the dark. Because sometimes your enemy sets your table better than a friend. The weight of it all started to press in. The isolation was the worst part. Every time I drove past that gate with its ugly sign and double chains, it felt like the world was closing in on me. The HOA was a united front, a wall of rules and whispers. I was just one man. It's easy to feel like you're crazy when you're the only one standing against the crowd. My phone would ring, and for a second I'd think it was a neighbor calling to offer support, but it was never them. It was a supplier asking when I was going to pay for the extra fuel, or my bank calling about the unusual withdrawals from my savings account. The financial bleed was becoming a hemorrhage. The question wasn't just how far I would go, it was how long I could last. One afternoon, I was out by the barn trying to patch a leaky water trough. My knuckles scraped and my patience worn thin. Calvin Hayes's old pickup truck rumbled up the drive. He got out carrying a brown paper bag that smelled like barbecue. "Figured you could use a decent lunch," he said, handing me the bag. We sat on the tailgate of my truck, not saying much at first, just eating brisket sandwiches. The simple act of someone showing up, of someone sharing a meal, felt huge. "They're trying to wear you down, son," Calvin said finally, wiping his mouth with a napkin. "It's the oldest trick in the book. Squeeze a man's wallet and his pride and hope he breaks." He told me stories about old-range disputes, conflicts that were settled with grit and cleverness, not just brute force. He reminded me that I came from strong stock. "Your grandpa, William," he said. "He wasn't the biggest man in a fight, but he was always the smartest. He'd watch and he'd wait, and he'd find the one loose board in the whole fence." It was exactly what I needed to hear. He wasn't offering a solution, but he was offering perspective. He was reminding me who I was. The next day, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. It was Sharon Mills, a quiet woman who lived a few houses down from Eleanor Vance inside the HOA. She spoke in a hushed, nervous voice. "Mr. Thorne, I hope you don't mind me calling. I got your number from the feed store." She told me she was at the last HOA board meeting, the one they held on Zoom. She said Eleanor had talked about me. "She called your ranch a blight on the community aesthetic. She told everyone you were trying to bully your way into using their private resources." Then Sharon dropped the bomb. She told the board they needed to hold the line, because if they gave in, people like you would be all over the place and the character of Whispering Creek would be ruined. There it was again. People like you. It was the confirmation I didn't want but knew was true. This wasn't just about a gate. It was about me. Sharon said she thought it was wrong, that most of the residents didn't care about the gate, but they were afraid of Eleanor. Before she hung up, she said, "Check the county plat maps, the ones from when the development was first filed. There's always something weird in those initial filings." It was a tiny breadcrumb, but it was more than I had before. That evening, for a little bit of a break, Ricky Sims came by. Ricky's a good-hearted disaster of a man who'd known me since grade school. He works in town selling insurance, but he fancies himself a cowboy. He showed up with a six-pack of cheap beer, wearing a brand-new Stetson that was a size too big for his head. "Heard you were in a scrap with the queen of the cul-de-sac," he said, popping 2 beers open. "I got a plan. We get a couple of my cousins, a couple of crowbars, and we have a little gate opening party in the middle of the night." Problem solved. I had to laugh. It was the worst idea I'd ever heard, but it felt good to laugh. We sat there as the sun went down, and Ricky told me stupid jokes and stories about his clients. He was a distraction, a brief moment of normal in a world that had gone sideways. His presence didn't solve my legal problems, but it helped shore up my spirit. It reminded me that there was still a world outside of my fight with Eleanor Vance. When he left, I felt better. I had Calvin's wisdom, Sharon's tip, and Ricky's well-meaning foolishness. I wasn't alone anymore. I had allies, even if they were an unlikely bunch. A retired trucker, a nervous neighbor, and a guy who thought felony property damage was a good solution. It was a start. Sharon's words kept echoing in my head. "Check the county plat maps." Calvin had told me to find the loose board. Maybe Sharon had just told me which part of the fence to start looking at. That night, for the first time in weeks, I didn't lie awake staring at the ceiling. I was starting to form a plan. A real plan. The next morning, I drove into Abilene to the Taylor County Administration Building. It's an old, imposing brick building that smells like dusty paper and floor wax. I hadn't been inside in years. I felt out of place in my work boots and jeans, walking past people in suits and ties. But I had a mission: find the loose board. The records office was in the basement, a maze of gray metal shelves and filing cabinets. A woman with glasses on a chain around her neck pointed me toward a bank of old microfilm readers and a wall of thick, heavy binders containing the plat maps. It was like stepping back in time. I started where Sharon Mills had suggested, with the initial filings for the Whispering Creek Estates development. I scrolled through endless pages of legal descriptions, surveys, and boundary lines. My eyes started to burn from staring at the glowing green text on the microfilm screen. I was looking for any mention of an easement, any right-of-way, any document that would prove my family's historic access to the creek. I spent hours at it. I found the developer's original plans, the utility layouts, the drainage reports. I found everything except what I was looking for. There was no mention of the Thorn Ranch. No easement. No handshake deal recorded for posterity. It was like we didn't exist. A feeling of cold dread started to creep in. Maybe Eleanor was right. Maybe in the cold, hard language of the law, I was just a trespasser. Maybe my grandpa's word meant nothing because it wasn't written on the right piece of paper and filed in the right dusty basement. I was about to give up. My back ached and my head was pounding. I leaned back in the squeaky chair, rubbing my eyes. I thought about my cattle standing by the fence, waiting. I thought about my grandpa and the trust he'd placed in me. I couldn't just walk away. I decided to try one more thing. Instead of looking for something that proved my right to use the lane, I decided to look at the lane itself. I pulled up the main plat map for the entire HOA. It was a huge, sprawling document showing every single lot, every street, every common area. I traced the boundaries with my finger. Lot 1, Lot 2, on and on. Then I got to the edge of the development where it bordered my ranch. I saw the access lane clearly marked, and then I saw something else, something strange. The lane and the little patch of ground the gate sat on had a different border. It was a thin, dotted line separating it from the rest of the HOA's common property. And inside that little sliver of land was a tiny number, 21B. It wasn't labeled as a common area. It was its own separate parcel. My heart started beating faster. I went back to the main index and looked up parcel 21B. It was tiny, less than a quarter of an acre, a long, thin rectangle that was basically just the lane and a few feet of scrub on either side. I took the parcel number to the clerk at the tax office counter. "Can you tell me who owns this?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She typed the number into her computer. Her eyebrows went up. "Well, that's an odd one," she said. "It's still listed under the name of the original developer. Prairie Sky Holdings Incorporated. Looks like they went out of business about 10 years ago." She kept typing. "And it looks like the property taxes haven't been paid on it in, wow, 8 years. My mind was racing. If the HOA didn't own it, they had no right to lock it. They were the trespassers. So, what happens to a piece of land like this? I asked. The clerk shrugged. Usually, after a certain number of years of non-payment, the county puts it up for auction at tax sale. Let me check the list. She clicked a few more times. A slow smile spread across her face. Well, what do you know? She said, looking up at me over her glasses. Parcel 21B is on the list for next month's sale. Goes to the highest bidder. I stood there stunned. It was the loose board. It was the key. The very ground Eleanor Vance had planted her obnoxious sign on. The piece of Texas she had claimed with such authority didn't even belong to her. And it was for sale. I walked out of the tax office into heat that felt earned. Every step to the truck was a plan forming. I made 3 calls with the AC blasting. 1 to a lawyer, 1 to a friend, 1 to the sale barn. The sale barn hurt. "I'll move 8 yearlings Friday," I told the manager. He knew my voice. "You sure, Marcus?" "I'm sure." He said the market was soft this week. I said I didn't care. Back at the ranch, I rolled the old hay baler out of the shed, the one Grandpa had rebuilt twice, paint sunburned to chalk. A kid from Craigslist looked at it like it was junk and offered cash like it was charity. I told him no, then yes, because keys beat pride when water's at stake. Calvin showed up without being asked and backed his trailer to the pens. We sorted calves amid dust and hollers and the kind of silence men use when things matter too much to name. That night, I spread receipts on the kitchen table. Fuel, vet, parts, now livestock, now a baler, and drew a line under the number that would buy a strip of dirt and a future. I wrote 21B in the margin. I thought of Eleanor's binder, the deputy's eyes, and a creek that never stopped running, even when people did. I could feel Grandpa at my shoulder, not smiling, just nodding once, like, "There's your loose board." The drive back to the ranch was different. The heavy weight that had been sitting on my shoulders was gone, replaced by a buzzing, nervous energy. I had a path. It was a narrow one and a risky one, but it was a path. The first person I called was Howard Finch, a lawyer in town. He wasn't one of the slick downtown types. His office was a small, neat building just off the main square. Howard was a quiet, older man who mostly handled wills and land deals. He was steady. I laid out the whole story right there in his office. I showed him the parcel map I'd printed out, with the little sliver of land highlighted. He listened patiently, looking at the map through his reading glasses, nodding every so often. When I was done, he leaned back in his chair. "Well, Marcus," he said, a small smile playing on his lips. It seems to me that your HOA president has built her castle on borrowed land. He confirmed my thinking. If we could acquire that parcel, it would solve everything. The gate, the lane, it would all be mine. But he gave me a stern warning. You cannot be the one to buy it. The moment your name appears on that bid list, Eleanor Vance will get wind of it. The HOA has deeper pockets than you do. They'll outbid you and lock you out forever, and this time it will be legal. He was right. I had to be a ghost. That's when I thought of Derek Shaw. Derek and I had played high school football together. He now ran a successful contracting business, a mid-sized LLC that did projects all over the county. He was sharp, trustworthy, and he owed me a favor from a few years back when I helped him pull a cement truck out of a muddy work site with my big tractor. I called him that afternoon and explained the situation. He whistled. "Man, that is some next-level HOA craziness," he said. "So, you want my company to buy a piece of land for you? I need the purchase to be made by a legal entity that has no connection to me," I said. "I'll give you the money for the purchase and any fees. It'll be a quiet transaction. Once the deed is filed, you sign it over to me." Derek didn't hesitate. "Consider it done, man. I can't stand those HOA tyrants. Anyway, we had our plan. Derek's company, Shaw Construction LLC, would be the official buyer. We wouldn't wait for the auction. Howard Finch found out that the parcel was on the county's struck-off tax resale list, so they could sell it directly for back taxes, penalties, and fees. It was a faster, quieter way to do it. The total came to just over $6,000. It was a lot of money for a useless-looking sliver of land, but to me, it was priceless. It was the key to my survival. Getting that money together was the next hurdle. I had to sell a small herd of yearlings I'd been planning to keep and an old hay baler that had been my grandpa's. It hurt to let them go. It felt like I was selling off pieces of my heritage to save the rest of it. It was a gamble. A huge gamble. We were in a race against the clock. We had to get the offer in, get it accepted, and get the sale closed before Eleanor or anyone on her board got curious about that little piece of land. The next 2 weeks were the most stressful of my life. Every day felt like a year. Derek submitted the offer. We waited. I kept hauling water, my savings dwindling with every trip. The big red sign reading "Private Property" seemed to mock me every time I passed it. I saw Eleanor Vance's white SUV drive by slowly a few times, her checking on her locked gate, making sure her little kingdom was secure. She had no idea the ground beneath her feet was about to shift. Finally, the call came from Derek. "We got it," he said, his voice excited. "The county accepted the offer. They're drawing up the paperwork. Closing is in 10 days. 10 days. It felt like an eternity. Rumors were starting to spread. I heard from Ricky Sims that someone at the local diner was talking about the rancher who was trying to sue the HOA. The story was already getting twisted. The walls were closing in. We had to make it to closing day without anyone finding out who was really behind the purchase of a worthless-looking strip of dirt on the edge of town. Closing day didn't feel real. It happened in a small, generic title company office that smelled like stale coffee and toner. I wasn't even there. I was sitting in my truck in the parking lot, watching the front door like a hawk. Derek went in alone, dressed in his work polo shirt with the Shaw Construction logo on it. To anyone watching, he was just a local business owner buying a small piece of commercial property. I had transferred the money to his business account the day before. My gut was in a knot. This was it. Every dollar I had scraped together was on the line. The question of how far a man would go was being answered right here in this anonymous parking lot. I would go this far. I would risk it all. An hour later, Derek walked out. He wasn't smiling. His face was neutral. He walked over to my truck and got in the passenger seat, closing the door softly. He didn't say anything for a moment. He just looked at me. My heart sank. "It didn't go through," I said, my voice flat. He broke into a huge grin. "Went through like a charm," he said, slapping a folder of documents onto the dashboard. "You, my friend, are now the proud owner of the most expensive, ugliest sliver in Taylor County." He handed me a single, brand new, shiny brass key. Derek had already filed the LLC deed at the courthouse and emailed a one-page letter naming me agent for the parcel until my transfer posted. By noon, the LLC deed was live in the county system. It was the key to a heavy-duty padlock he had picked up on the way over. "Thought you might want a new one," he said. I just stared at the key in my palm. It felt heavy, like it was worth more than gold. It was the key to my future, the key to my grandpa's legacy. I drove straight back to the ranch, my mind clear and calm for the first time in months. I didn't waste any time. I grabbed the big bolt cutters from my workshop. They were heavy and cool in my hands. I walked to the gate. The two chains, one put there by Eleanor and the other by her board member in the middle of the night, were still there. The big red private property sign was still there. It all looked so permanent, so official. I put the jaws of the bolt cutters around the first chain. The parcel was ours on record now. Those chains were trespass metal on my gate. I squeezed the handles together. There was a sharp, satisfying snap that echoed in the quiet afternoon air. The chain fell away. I did the same to the second one. It broke just as easily. I unwound the useless metal and threw it in the back of my truck. Then I took off their lock. I hung my new heavy-duty padlock on the hasp, tested the key, then swung the gate wide open. It groaned on its old hinges, a familiar, welcome sound. Then I did what I'd been dreaming of doing for weeks. I walked to the edge of the pasture, cupped my hands around my mouth, and let out the long, low call that my grandpa had taught me. The call that means water. At first, there was nothing. Then one head came up, then another. A low moo answered mine, and then they started to move. It started as a walk, then a trot, then a slow, steady tide of black and brown hides, all moving down the lane they knew so well. They filed through the open gate, their hooves kicking up the dust, and headed for the creek. I just stood there and watched them. I watched them walk into the cool water, burying their noses, drinking deeply. The sounds they made were different now. Not sounds of distress, but sounds of contentment. I leaned against the gate post my grandpa, and I had set together all those years ago. The sun was warm on my face. The fight wasn't over, I knew that. But for the first time in a long time, my cattle were drinking from their creek and the gate was open. And for now, that was enough. 2 days passed, 2 peaceful, quiet days. The cattle were happy. I was happy. I spent the time fixing things around the ranch, the simple, honest work that I loved. I knew it was the calm before the storm. Eleanor Vance was not the type of person to let things go. She was probably building up a full head of steam, planning her next move. The confrontation came on Saturday morning. I was oiling the hinges on the gate when her white SUV came down the road and pulled to an abrupt stop. She got out, dressed in crisp white pants and another one of her power pink blouses. And just like the first time, she had company. The same 2 deputies from before pulled up right behind her. She had a triumphant smile on her face. It was the smile of someone who was absolutely certain they had won. She pointed a perfectly manicured finger at the gate. "Deputies," she said, her voice ringing with authority. "As you can see, he has destroyed our property. The chains have been cut. The lock has been replaced. This is willful destruction of property and trespassing. I want him arrested." The deputies looked at the cut chains on the ground. They looked at the new lock on the gate. Then they looked at me. Their faces were grim. They remembered our last conversation. To them, it looked like I had ignored their warning and taken the law into my own hands. The younger deputy started walking toward me, his hand resting on his belt. "Sir, we talked about this," he said, his voice tight. "You were told this was a civil matter." I didn't say a word. I held up one hand, a quiet signal for him to wait. I walked over to my truck, opened the passenger door, and picked up the folder Derek had given me. I walked back to the deputies, my movements slow and deliberate. Eleanor was still talking, her voice rising. "This is exactly the kind of behavior we cannot tolerate in our community. There are rules, and he seems to think they don't apply to him." Her voice trailed off as I opened the folder. I didn't hand the papers to her. I handed them directly to the older deputy, the one who seemed to be in charge. Inside on top was the notarized and filed deed for Parcel 21B, with Shaw Construction LLC listed as the owner. Behind that was another document, a simple transfer of title from the LLC to me, Marcus Thorne, also filed with the county that morning. And behind that was a copy of the official county parcel map, the one from the records office with Parcel 21B highlighted in yellow, showing clearly that it was a separate piece of land from the HOA's common areas. The deputy took the papers and started to read. His eyes scanned the legal language of the deed. He looked at the map. He looked back at the deed. The younger deputy looked over his shoulder. I saw a flicker of understanding, then surprise, in the older deputy's eyes. He looked up from the papers, over at the gate, then back down at the map. He was connecting the dots. He was realizing that the ground he was standing on, the very dirt Eleanor Vance was claiming as hers, was not. I had one more thing. I pulled out my phone, found the video from that Thursday night, and held it out. "This is one of her board members," I said quietly, adding a second chain to the gate in the middle of the night after a tow truck blocked the lane. The deputy watched the short, damning clip. He saw the flashing lights, the man with the chain, the deliberate act of intimidation. He folded the papers neatly and handed them back to me. He took a step back, away from me and toward Eleanor. His entire posture had changed. The suspicion was gone, replaced by a weary professionalism. "Ma'am," he said, his voice now flat and official. "I've reviewed these documents. This parcel of land, the one this gate is on, it belongs to Mr. Thorne. The sale was recorded with the county. He's not trespassing. He's on his own property." Eleanor Vance's jaw dropped. The smug smile vanished, replaced by a mask of pure disbelief. "What? That's impossible. That's HOA land." The deputy just shook his head slowly. "No, ma'am. According to this official map, it's not. It never was. They had assumed it was HOA common area after build-out. A paperwork miss no one checked." He gestured back toward her car. "This is a civil matter, but right now you're the one on his property. I suggest you take it up with your lawyers," he said. "We're not deciding this. The deed speaks for itself. We're here so no one makes a bad choice. We're just here to keep the peace." The script had been completely flipped. The words he had used to dismiss me were now being used to dismiss her. Her face turned from pale to a deep, blotchy red. She looked from the deputy to me to the gate, her mind unable to process her total defeat. She stabbed a finger in my direction, her voice a low hiss. "This isn't over. You'll be hearing from my lawyer." Then she turned, stomped back to her SUV, and sped off, leaving a cloud of dust and stunned silence behind her. True to her word, the papers arrived a week later. A courier delivered a thick envelope to my door. The Whispering Creek Estates Homeowners Association was suing me. It was a long, complicated document full of legal jargon, but the gist of it was simple. They claimed the purchase of the land was fraudulent. They claimed there was a prescriptive easement that gave them control of the lane. They claimed my actions had caused the community irreparable harm. They were asking a judge to invalidate the sale and grant them permanent control of the gate. Eleanor Vance wasn't just trying to win. She was trying to erase my victory entirely. I took the lawsuit straight to Howard Finch's office. He read through it, a slight frown on his face. "This is a desperation move," he said, tossing the papers onto his desk. "It's a nuisance suit. She has no real case, but she's hoping she can bury you in legal fees until you give up." He looked at me over his glasses. "She's underestimating you." The core question came back to me again, harder this time. How far would I go? I had won the land, but now I had to defend the win. It meant more legal fees, more time, more stress. It meant stepping into a world I knew nothing about, a courtroom. But there was no turning back. "We fight it," I said. "We fight it and we win." Howard nodded, a determined look on his face. "Good. Because this is the kind of case I enjoy." The weeks leading up to the court date were a blur of meetings with Howard, gathering documents, and going over my testimony. Howard's strategy was simple: stick to the facts. He said their prescriptive easement claim cut against them. Historic open use was my family's, not the HOA's. No emotion, no drama, just a clear, logical presentation of what happened. He said, "Judges don't have time for stories, Marcus. They want a timeline and a map." The day of the hearing, I put on my best shirt and a clean pair of jeans. It was the closest thing to a suit I owned. When I walked into the courthouse, I saw a dozen of my neighbors from the HOA sitting in the gallery. Sharon Mills gave me a small, encouraging nod. Calvin Hayes was there, too, looking solid and immovable in the back row. They had come to watch. Eleanor was already there, sitting at the plaintiff's table with a slick-looking lawyer in an expensive suit. She wore a severe gray dress and refused to even look in my direction. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. The judge was a no-nonsense woman in her 60s with sharp eyes that seemed to see right through you. Eleanor's lawyer went first. He talked for a long time about community harmony, property values, and implied understandings. He painted me as an aggressive outsider who had exploited a loophole to threaten the peace and security of the residents. It was a good story, full of emotion and vague accusations. Then it was Howard's turn. He didn't tell a story. He presented a timeline. He walked the judge through the undisputed facts, projecting them on a large screen for the whole court to see. First, a copy of the original plat map. "Your Honor," Howard said, his voice calm and clear. "As you can see, Parcel 21B was established as a separate property from its inception." Next, he showed the tax records. For 10 years, the owner of record, Prairie Sky Holdings, failed to pay taxes. For 10 years, the Whispering Creek HOA, the plaintiff, did not claim ownership or pay taxes on this land. He continued, step by logical step. He showed the county's official notice of the tax sale. He showed the legally filed offer from Shaw Construction LLC. He showed the canceled check for the payment. And finally, he showed the clean, legally recorded deed transferring the property to me. Then he put up pictures of the big red HOA warning sign that read, "Private property. Contact the Homeowners Association. Violators will be prosecuted." Then Howard said, "Your Honor, the plaintiff is claiming irreparable harm, but the evidence shows they were the ones acting as if they owned land that was never theirs. They levied fines and blocked access to a property they had no legal claim to." As his final exhibit, he played the video from my phone. The courtroom was silent as we all watched the grainy footage of the board member chaining the gate in the dark, with the tow truck's lights flashing. The judge watched the video intently, her face unreadable. Eleanor's lawyer tried a salvage dive. "Mr. Thorne," he said, "isn't it true you intended to use this land purchase to bully my client?" Howard didn't let me answer. Objection. Argumentative. The judge flicked 2 fingers. Sustained. Ask a question tied to title or trespass, counsel. He pivoted. "Did you ever have written permission from the HOA to use that lane?" "I never claimed I did," I said. "I claim my family used it since before the HOA existed." He smiled thin. "Exactly. Before. Times change." I looked at the map on the screen. The creek didn't. He called Eleanor. She sat straight, pearls bright, voice honeyed. "We acted to protect safety. Children play near that access. Large animals, heavy trucks." Howard stood. "Who placed the additional chain at 11:07 p.m.? Eleanor blinked. "I don't manage minute-to-minute operations." Howard tapped the paused video. Todd's face. "The chain, the tow rig's plate huge as a billboard. Is Mr. Todd Coleman on your board?" Her pause was too long. "He volunteers." The judge looked over her glasses. "Answer the question, Ms. Vance." "Yes," Eleanor said, smaller now. "He is." Howard's last note was plain. No deed, no taxes paid, no map that shows their claim. But there is a video of intimidation on land they don't own. The gallery rustled like dry grass for a breath. Even Eleanor's pearls seemed to dull. The judge capped her pen. The room held still, waiting to hear the fenced line in her voice. When it was over, she looked at Eleanor's lawyer. "Do you have any actual evidence," she asked, her voice sharp, "that your client has any legal claim to this specific parcel of land? A deed? A title?" The lawyer stammered. "Well, no, Your Honor, but the historical usage." The judge cut him off. "The historical usage was by Mr. Thorne's family, not yours." She looked at her notes for a long moment. The silence in the room was absolute. "The facts of this case are remarkably simple," the judge said, finally looking up. "The purchase of parcel 21B by the defendant was conducted legally through a county-approved process. The title is clear. The property belongs to him." She turned her gaze on Eleanor and her lawyer. "The HOA's suit is dismissed. Furthermore, I find that this action was frivolous and brought in bad faith. The plaintiff, the Whispering Creek HOA, is ordered to pay all of Mr. Thorne's reasonable legal fees and court costs from HOA funds, not individuals, meaning homeowner dues, the money for parks and potholes." A quiet gasp went through the gallery. Eleanor Vance's face was a stony mask of disbelief. I felt Howard's hand clap me on the shoulder. It was over. We had won. The law, the real law, not the twisted version in Eleanor's binder, had prevailed. The aftermath of a storm is always quiet. The news of the verdict rolled through Whispering Creek like a slow-moving thundercloud. The part that got everyone's attention wasn't just that I had won, but the last part of the judge's ruling. The HOA had to pay my legal fees. Their money, the homeowner's money, was going to be used to pay for Eleanor Vance's personal vendetta. That changed everything. Suddenly, people who had been afraid to speak up, who had just gone along with Eleanor's agenda to keep the peace, started asking questions. Calvin and Sharon Mills helped fan the flames. They started talking to their neighbors, explaining what had really happened. They shared the story not as a property dispute, but as an abuse of power. They pointed out how much money the board had wasted trying to bully a man off land that was rightfully his. The conversation shifted. I was no longer the outsider causing trouble. I was the neighbor who had been wronged. The focus turned squarely on Eleanor and her hand-picked board. A special meeting of the homeowners was called. I wasn't there, of course, but Calvin told me all about it. He said it was packed. People were angry. They demanded to know how much of their money had been spent on this lawsuit. They asked why no one on the board had bothered to simply check the county property map before starting a war. Eleanor tried to defend herself, but the room was done with buzzwords. Neighbors asked real questions. How much money? Why no map check? By the end, they passed a one-page, good neighbor access rule that protects old access points. Then, they started a recall petition for the board. The next week, the big red HOA sign vanished. A refund check came from Howard, fees paid out of HOA funds. So, I bought back the yearlings I'd sold. I took my own lock off the gate. No need for keys when neighbors act right. Some evenings I see kids at the creek skipping stones. That's what land is for. Sometimes Eleanor's white SUV rolls by. She doesn't stop. The recall worked. There's a new board now. Sharon's on it. They talk potholes and a barbecue, not fights. I walk to the gate, run a hand over the old wood, and think of my grandpa. He taught me calm, fair, stubborn. This taught me one more thing. When help won't come and the rules bend wrong, learn the map.